Russian influence is growing in Africa. From West Africa in countries such as Mali and Burkina Faso to South Africa, the continent's most advanced economy. Western propaganda to isolate Russia has failed miserably. A demonstrator in the Central African Republic, a former French colony, says Russia has played a positive role in his country.
We recognize a friend in suffering. When we were in crisis, it was Russia that came to our rescue to liberate the country. We saw France, which was there but did nothing, and France continues to bully us. We have to tell certain truths today. Russia is coming to liberate us. Now we are free, and we must support Russia at all cost until our last breath. Russia came to our country in the moment of crisis. Our country has suffered. Our country has been mistreated by the rebels. And that is why we came to support Russia.
Hello, I'm Mubarak Kenya, and a warm welcome to Africa Today, a weekly program that gives you an alternative view of news and events making headlines in Africa. Today we are focusing on the unfolding Cold War in Africa between Russia and Western powers. African countries are meanwhile reasserting their independence while rejecting Western imperialism and neo-colonialism. We are asking, will African countries succeed in their move to stop Western powers intent on meddling and countering Russia in the continent? The second part of our show today will be on continuing exploitation of Western and Central African countries by France through the CFA franc currency. Our experts today will give us their incisive analysis on these two subjects, and you can be part of the conversation by sending us your comments through our social media handle.
Russia-West neo-Cold War in Africa. Russia has been making diplomatic inroads in African countries that were seen as backyards of Western neo-colonial powers, especially France. The US-led NATO military alliance has been angered by Russia's increasing influence in Africa, particularly at this time that the alliance is indirectly engaged in a military conflict with Russia in Ukraine.
Most African countries have refused to back NATO in its conflict with Russia. In fact, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa has blamed NATO for the war in Ukraine.
The war could have been avoided if NATO had heeded the warnings from amongst its own leaders and officials over the years that its eastward expansion would lead to greater, not less, instability in the region.
Well, to discuss increasing neo-Cold War rivalry between Russia and NATO in Africa, we have contacted Nefta Freeman, a coordinating committee member of the Black Alliance for Peace. Thanks for your time today. Now, over the recent months, we have seen a flurry of diplomatic activity with top-ranking US and Russian officials visiting Africa, while Germany unveiled a new strategy for Africa. Now, are we witnessing a new Cold War in Africa amid the NATO-Russia conflict in Ukraine?
Yes, the heightened engagement with Africa is unquestionably a part of a new Cold War by the West, led by the United States. It has been waging a Cold War against Russia and China in particular. And so this is playing out in Africa as a new scramble for Africa. Africa remains central to the global market's supply of raw materials and has become also an export, a place of exporting to export finished goods to. But over the last decade, the competition has been increasingly militarized, notably with the US NATO destruction of Libya in 2011 and turning Africa into really pretty much a hotbed of violent extremist activity, giving the US this and other Western countries, France and whatnot, this pretext to say, well, they have to help African countries with militarization, AFRICOM, US Africa Command, and the French Foreign Legion, and these to come and stop the violent extremism that in fact, the US is responsible, the NATO is responsible for.
Uganda President Yoweri Museveni hosted Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and said he saw no reason to criticize Russia over its military operation in Ukraine. Museveni said Russia has a long history of backing African liberation when the continent was colonized by Western colonial powers.
The Africans started organizing, led by new forces. And the first group was in South Africa in 1912, when the African National Congress was founded. That was now the modern African anti-colonial resistance movement. Fortunately, and that's how Russia comes in. In 1917, a new force took over Russia. These were the Bolsheviks. I don't know what problems you have with the Bolsheviks, whether you like them or you don't, but for us, we appreciate them because they supported us. They started supporting our anti-colonial struggle. And that is our relationship with Russia. Russia, so the Soviet Union, supporting the anti-colonial movement in Africa.
Russian Foreign Minister visited Africa in February, and this was his third visit to the continent after the start of Moscow's special military operation in Ukraine. Analysts believe that Western powers are using strong arm tactics to counter Russia in Africa.
It appears that Russia is succeeding, and I think that has more to do with the insistence of the United States and the Western countries, but particularly the United States, of using like strong arm tactics. And that's traditionally what it does. That's also what characterizes neo-colonialism. Using sanctions, using the international monetary, and the sanctions are actually exercised through the financial institutions. A lot of them are exercised also by the IMF and the World Bank and whatnot. And so they insist on not respecting the sovereignty of African countries. African countries should be able to have their own relationships with whoever they so choose, but the U.S. wants to dictate that. And so when Sergei Lavrov comes, and they actually are coming after on the heels, pretty much in December of the heels of, in December, the U.S. Africa's leaders summit that happened in Washington, D.C. in December did not have the expected results that the U.S. wanted. Them trying to, kind of court African leaders to take their sides in the world in this global competition for things. So the U.S. is becoming more overt in their strong arm policy.
Addressing the media after meeting his Eritrean counterpart Osman Saleh in February, Lavrov said Russia favors the principle of African solutions to African problems.
We had a detailed discussion of the African agenda. We have pointed out the need to normalize the situation in the conflict hotspots of Africa. We paid special attention to the situation in the African Horn region. We, together with our Eritrean friends, believe that in order to overcome the regional crisis, we require the promotion of a comprehensive approach through coordinated actions of the African states themselves, with the support from the international community. We have confirmed that Russia, including in its status as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, will continue making its contribution to strengthening security and stability in the African continent, based upon the well-known principle, African solutions for African problems. We shall not impose any external solutions to the Africans, and we see numerous attempts of doing that.
Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov also said that Western media outlets have been distorting facts while covering his tour across sub-Saharan Africa. Now, what's your take on this statement by Lavrov?
Well, they have to distort facts. The U.S., I think a lot of times I think the U.S. and the leadership, the ruling class of the United States, because it's not regular people, believe their own perceptions about the world. This comes from a colonial mindset. But also at the same time, they have to sidestep the hypocrisy that they practice, the double standards they practice. One of the things, and I can remember this one distortion of facts, which is really an odd one, is to say, well, Russia and Lavrov are only visiting countries where there's rich mineral resources in Africa. This doesn't really make any sense to anyone who understands Africa. Every place in Africa is rich in mineral resources. It's not really a place you can go that you're not going to be able to, to have go to some place that doesn't have rich mineral resources.
South African Defense and Military Veterans Minister Thandi Modise has hit out against the United States for trying to bully African countries from doing business with Russia. Modise said the Countering Malign Russian Activities in Africa Act, which seeks to sanction any African businesses or people doing business with Russia, should be rejected by African countries. More African countries are expected to defy the West.
I think we will see more, and we have seen more of the West, and a lot of it was when I mentioned earlier the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit, where they invited a lot of these leaders to Washington, D.C. Some of those deliberations, the African countries were talking about how the U.S. is not really respecting the self-determination. I don't know if they use the word self-determination, but the rights of African countries to do business how they see fit. And that it was much along the lines of strong arming and what we call, in the Black Lives Matter piece, we refer to it as gangsterism because that's what it is. But you're seeing a lot of what the African countries are more likely to defy it because the other forces, China, Russia, even whoever you can name, other forces beside the U.S. and besides the Western NATO countries, and people can talk about what their interests or what their real interests are or not, but they come with they come differently. Their bilateral relationships, their agreements. The U.S. is a gangster, and then NATO, they're gangster countries. We refer to that meaning they impose their will.
A tweet by the German Foreign Ministry in which it used a leopard emoji in referring to the Russian foreign minister's visit to Africa has created uproar in Africa after it appeared offensive to some. Now, can such a tweet be indicative of Germany's colonial stereotypical view on Africa?
It certainly can be indicative of it. I don't know what was in their mind. I mean, Germany and the Western countries, they come out of a legacy of colonization and a dehumanization of Africa. They do not respect African culture, African anything, and they can't even take responsibility for the underdeveloped state that Africa is in terms of where there's poverty and these kind of things. They don't take responsibility for that, and it's directly at the shoulders of Europe and the U.S. Neo-colonialism and former tradition, former colonialism or formal colonialism, as described by, if we could look at like the seminal work of scholars like Walter Rodney, and the book of how Europe underdeveloped Africa, and even the works of like Kwame Nkrumah talking about neo-colonialism and outlining the effects of neo-colonialism.
South African Foreign Minister Naledi Pandor defended the decision during a joint media briefing alongside her visiting Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, who is in the country for bilateral talks.
All countries conduct military exercises with friends worldwide, so there should be no compulsion on any country that it should conduct them with any other partner. It's part of a natural course of relations between countries. So I think we need to explain this to the public.
Now, what message is this military drill sending to Western countries?
These joint military operations in the U.S. has embarked on this, this militarization of the continent through the U.S. Africa Command, AFRICOM. It's since 2008, maybe starting in 2007, where it has all of this, military bases around, and the rhetoric around or even its maneuvers around countering China and the legislation countering Russia. This sends the message to the West. These new developments with the naval drills is that you're not, we don't consider you, the hegemon anymore, or even the right to be the hegemon, and that we will even we're not going to take sides also in the war between these forces.
Very well put there. Africa is reasserting its independence, and the joint naval drills by the South African Navy with Russia and China are a pointer to this new realignment of power in Africa. We now take a short break before our next topic on the CFA franc.
CFA franc, French colonial tax in Africa.
The CFA, which stood for French colonialism in Africa in 1945, now stands for Africa Financial Community. It is used in 14 African countries with a combined population of about 150 million and 235 billion USD of gross domestic product.
The CFA franc limits monetary sovereignty. France guarantees the value of the CFA franc, and in return, the countries that use it are required to at least 50% of their foreign exchange reserves with the French treasury. Because the exchange rate between the CFA franc and euro is fixed, the central banks of the two CFA franc zones need to follow the monetary policies of the European Central Bank in order to maintain the peg. In other words, the European Central Bank effectively sets interest rates for countries that use the CFA franc.
The CFA franc is seen as a clear example of how France pursues a deliberate policy of continuing to plunder the countries it once colonized. Dr. Arikana Chihombori-Kwao, a former African Union ambassador to the US, weighs in here on how the CFA franc has disadvantaged African countries.
France is taking out of Africa, Francophone Africa, over $500 billion. Over $500 billion. We, the Africans, the poor countries, we're giving France over $500 billion a year in, year out. And no one is talking about it. The latest figures are saying for every $14 billion that France takes out of Africa, by the time they finish investing it, they're realizing upwards of $300 billion for every $14 billion. So in actuality, France is taking out of Africa trillions of dollars year in, year out.
Now, for more on this continued exploitation of Africa by France, we have contacted Mustafa Traore, an academic and political commentator. Thanks for your time today. Now, the CFA franc is seen as a vestige of French colonialism in Africa and has been referred by many as a sort of colonial tax on African countries. So why is this currency still being used in parts of Central and Western Africa?
It is true that it is a colonial currency. The reason why it is still used, it is because it is in the interest of France. We know that each time you had an African leader willing to change the situation to go out of the franc CFA, this politician was eliminated. So we understand that the mechanism of the franc CFA was inherited from the time of the Nazi regime. It is the Nazi regime who first used it against the French government, against the French nation. And then after the Second World War, the French used the same system, the system that was used by the Nazi, against the Africans.
Former Burkina Faso President Thomas Sankara opposed the CFA system because he believed that it was part of the economic stagnation that country endured. CFA franc is indeed the source of economic backwardness of Western and Central African countries, especially considering the fact that those countries using this currency are some of the poorest in the world.
Now, many analysts believe that the CFA franc was meant to control the cost of access to raw materials from the colonies and enable Paris to maintain its grip on the economies of these African countries. Now, can you elaborate further on some of the advantages France gets in ensuring African countries continue using the CFA franc?
yeah, they can buy, they decide on the prices, which means that if something is too expensive, you can say, okay, I'm going to devaluate your currency, and now this is what your money is worth. So, and the thing is that the African currency is printed in France. Can you imagine? So it is printed in France. So, which means that this is what I sometimes explain to some of my students, because I teach English economics, and I tell to my students that there's nothing that the French government cannot buy in these countries, because they have the printing machine. Once you have the printing machine, nothing exists on earth in these countries that the French government cannot buy.
French President Macron is trying to influence the renaming of the CFA franc to ECO after the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, decided that a new regional currency will take effect in 2027. Some ECOWAS members not using CFA franc have rejected French influence in the transition to a new currency. France is apparently sabotaging a strong and independent common African currency in West and Central Africa.
What is very surprising here is the fact that France wants to have its word on it. Okay, we are dealing with African countries. It's their currency. So it's not to the French president to say how they are going to name the new currency and what they are going to do. Okay, if the African decides, if the Africans decide to change the currency, to change the system, they are free to do it. But France wants to be part of it, and what the Africans are saying that they do not want you to be part of it. And the first people, or the first countries to oppose the participation of France in that new currency are the English-speaking countries. Okay, those who are not using the franc CFA. So that's very important. So we know that, and it's not me saying it, it was former President Jacques Chirac who once said it, without some African countries, France is nothing.
Demonstrators take to the streets regularly in several French-speaking African cities to reject the CFA currency, saying it prevents development and is keeping countries in poverty.
We must do all it takes to ensure that the CFA franc is abolished forever.
With the growing unpopularity of France in Africa and the younger generation's rejection of its presence, are we going to see more demands for the dumping of the CFA franc?
Yes, I think so. I think, yeah, this is what is very likely to happen. Many countries are trying to set free from, let's say, the chains of France. We saw it in Mali and Burkina Faso and Guinea, and I'm sure that we will have more countries trying to reject the French influence, and they do it first militarily, and the next step is the currency. So for sure, that is the next step.
Well, there you have it. Many African countries are going to free themselves from the shackles of French neo-colonialism. I'd like to thank our guest, Moustapha Traoré, for his insight today. That brings us to the end of this week's edition of Africa Today. It's been great having you. Drop us a line through our social media handle appearing on the screen. And this show and all our previous episodes are available at our website, presstv.ir. Thanks a lot for watching, and goodbye for now.